Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to focus on a short story that grabbed my attention. One that is about an intrusive child, or maybe something else. I am referring to Miriam by Truman Capote, which was published in the 1945 issue of Mademoiselle. For those who don't know, and I have a feeling a lot of people might know who Truman Capote is, maybe not so much, 50 years down the line, a lot of people don't really talk about Truman Capote as much anymore. But for those who don't know, Truman Capote was an American author, mostly known for writing books, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, but he also wrote a bunch of short stories, including Miriam, which I'm talking about today. He's most known for writing In Cold Blood, which is a nonfiction account of murders that occurred in Kansas or some other place. I'll put it up there if I'm wrong. But he spent quite a bit of time writing it, and he was very well regarded for that work. I believe he even wrote it with the help of Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. So there's a bit of a connection there. And he was highly connected with other writers and had a little bit of a celebrity as a result, being somewhat known in pop culture circles. What's really interesting is that Truman Capote was gay at a time when being gay, in the 1950s and 60s would have gotten you either blacklisted or publicly shunned by society, but he was very loud and out about that. Although he didn't really, comment on the LGBT activism, he was still involved in that sort of thing. So that's, as we gear up for Pride Month and whatnot, this is a sort of connection there. What's also interesting is that I believe somebody wrote a biography about E.M. Forster, but never acknowledged that person was gay. And there's a story that Truman Capote openly called them out on a train for it because they were not acknowledging that aspect of their identity, which might have provided a key for understanding who that person was and what their works were about, which is very good. We should always strive to call people out for not telling the whole story whenever possible. I'm actually surprised I haven't talked about Truman Capote before because he is such a popular author, but here I am talking about him now, and I hope to talk a little bit more about him in the future. But without further ado, let's talk about Miriam. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Miriam focuses on Mrs. Miller, a woman who is described as a lonely widow, kind of living by herself, keeping to herself, just going about life without really talking to many other people. During one day she goes out and runs errands and everything, and she ends up deciding to go to the movie theater. While she's there, she runs into a small child with a hair like an albino, which is a very interesting way to describe someone. This child stands out to Miriam, and this child actually approaches Miriam and is like, "Hey, can you buy me a movie ticket so I can go see this movie?" And Mrs. Miller is intrigued by this and decides to actually do that, even though she feels like she's breaking some sort of law. But she also encourages the child to go back home to their parents because they might be a little bit worried about that child. And they, after the movie's over, they go their separate ways, and Mrs. Miller is at home when her bell begins to ring, and she has to go downstairs to figure out who's ringing her, and it turns out it is Miriam, who invites herself into Mrs. Miller's apartment, eats her food, and throws a vase on the ground. Even though Mrs. Miller is telling her to leave, she's being a general small little monster about everything. But the child does eventually leave. Mrs. Miller has a small fever, but she does get better, and she decides to like go out and run some more errands, and she surprisingly picks up some food that the child expressed interest in, which does seem significant. But while she's out running errands, she feels like she's being followed by a man, and she ends up ducking into a shop, and the man just walks past. She doesn't really know what that's about, but she does note that he is struggling with packages. Eventually, Mrs. Miller returns home, but she finds that Miriam has shown up outside her apartment again, and Mrs. Miller is like, I'm not going to open the door for you, go away. But then someone knocks on her door, indicating that she somehow got inside, and Mrs. Miller opens the door to discover that Miriam is sitting on a package of some sort, and is asking for help with that. But she tells Mrs. Miller that she's actually going to stay with her now, which agitates Mrs. Miller, and she's like, I'm done with this. I need help with this. So she goes downstairs to ask for help from her neighbors, and she stays with one of the women while her husband goes off to, check on Miriam. But the husband returned and says there was no child there. And they think that Mrs. Miller is kind of crazy at this point. She goes back upstairs, slowly begins to question reality, and closes her eyes and is like, well, I guess Miriam must have never existed. But she hears some ruffling around her apartment, including drawers opening and closing, and when she opens her eyes, we see that Miriam has said hello. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this story. One thing that I don't think I mentioned in the summary is that Mrs. Miller reveals that her first name is Miriam to Miriam. And she's like, oh, we have the same first name. Isn't that interesting? To which the child responds, no. But in terms of analysis, one of the ideas that Capote is leaning upon here in the story is that of intrusions into your everyday life. Like Miriam is an unwanted visitor in Mrs. Miller's, or an unwanted visitor in Mrs. Miller's quiet life. It's clear that Mrs. Miller doesn't want Miriam there, and that she was only nice to her, at the start of the story because she was, pleasant company. She was a small child who was interested in seeing a movie, and that was really the extent of the relationship that Mrs. Miller wanted with Miriam. But Miriam continues to show back up in Mrs. Miller's life, and it leaves Mrs. Miller agitated and uncomfortable. But what I think Truman Capote is getting at here is that Mrs. Miller, through these continued intrusions, is beginning to worry about losing her personal space. Like, her home is her space to be alone. She's been alone for quite a while, but Miriam is coming into it and violating that notion of that personal space. So I do like how Truman Capote gets at that, and the way that he shows that Miriam is being, an unwanted visitor in this scenario. But another interesting element of the story is that of the breakdown of the psychological reality. Mrs. Miller's mental state is clearly affected by Miriam's actions. Like, Miriam disrupts Mrs. Miller's world, but in very noticeable ways. She has to pay extra money to get this child into the theater. Miriam, when she follows Mrs. Miller home, presumably, she throws a vase on the ground that Mrs. Miller probably liked. And she also eats her food, which Mrs. Miller has to go out and get more of that food. Every second that the child is in her apartment violating her personal space is a second where she is not getting that comfort that she needs, that solace from the rest of the world. And then she, at the end of near the end of the story, she's like, I'm coming to move in. This is what's going to happen. And Mrs. Miller doesn't seem to get a say in the matter. Truman Capote is very clear. Children shouldn't be acting this way. And yet Miriam is, and for Mrs. Miller, she has no way to really say, child, go away, because this child refuses to go away, and Mrs. Miller isn't really going to beat her, because that is, you don't really do that to children. So the only answer is to call the police or ask the neighbors for help, and they clearly couldn't do anything because Miriam is still there at the end of the story. But there are other ways that this breakdown of psychological reality is happening. particularly with the old man who follows Mrs. Miller around in the middle of the story. He's carrying packages, and he just seems to be following her around while she's shopping. Although when she goes into a shop, he just walks on by. Was he actually following her? Mrs. Miller doesn't know. It's a very good question. And then when Mrs. Miller asks, one of the neighbors to check out our apartment, there's no one there. And there's the big question, like, did Mrs. Miller imagine this whole thing? Like, is she just, stressed at this point, dealing with illness and whatnot, and is imagining this child running around her apartment? Or did the child simply leave? Is the child real? There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. In times of terror or immense distress, there are moments when the mind waits, as though for a revelation, while a skein of calm is woven over thought. It is like a sleep or a supernatural trance, and during this lull one is aware of a force of quiet reasoning. Well, what if she had never really known a girl named Miriam? That she had been foolishly frightened on the street? In the end, like everything else, it was of no importance. For the only thing she had lost to Miriam was her identity, but now she knew she had found again the person who lived in this room, who cooked her own meals, who owned a canary, who was someone who could trust and believe in. Mrs. H.T. Miller. Yeah, I feel like that quote gets at the fear of that breakdown of psychological reality that Mrs. Miller has. Like, for a moment, she's like, did this child really exist? Who lives here? What is going on? I don't understand anything that's been happening in the past couple days. And near the end of the story, she's like, I guess I didn't know. I guess I know who I am now. I know that I live here. I know that all of these things are true. This is the world that I live in, and it's real. And Miriam is something else entirely. And it seems like she's really, coming to understand who she is. But of course, at the end of the story, she hears all that rustling around, and we don't see what happens to Mrs. Miller afterwards, but it's clearly not good. It's probably the case that she does not, she has a big break or something like that after hearing from the small child, which causes great distress. And I like how Truman Capote does that in this story. The last thing worth talking about is the obvious question that this story poses. What does Miriam represent? And I think it comes down to a couple different answers. The first, it could be a hallucination. First, Miriam is present in the daily events that happen to Mrs. Miller. First and foremost, Mrs. Miller says that her first name is Miriam. So it could be that she's hallucinating her younger self, just present in daily events brought on by stress or sickness of some sort. She also notes that near the end of the story, Miriam shows up with a package. But earlier in the day, she sees that old man carrying around the package, who seems to be following her, although he probably isn't. And so maybe she associates those two things together. And then she also ends up buying the exact food that Miriam craved when she first showed up. And it's possible that Mrs. Miller just likes those foods herself. And so she hallucinated a child who likes the exact same foods. And so this could all just be the result of some sort of illness, or again, a breakdown of her psychological reality. Of course, it could also just be her succumbing to loneliness. That's a second answer of what Miriam represents here. And it could just be the case that Mrs. Miller has been living alone for so long that she's generated a small child to keep her company. And although that child does agitate her, her decision to buy the foods that this child craved could be an indicator that she wants this child in her life, or that she wants to not be lonely anymore. So it's still kind of a hallucination, but for different reasons in this story. And then the last thing that I think it could represent is death, which is by far the most boring, the boring answer that I think I could generate here. It could just be that Mrs. Miller is sick near the end of her life, and death has shown up to toy with her. Specifically, it should be known that when Miriam shows up, she's like, I have a fever, I'm not feeling well, I'm uncomfortable, could you leave? And although it does seem like Mrs. Miller might be lying at first, I definitely think that she's telling the truth there in an effort to, just acknowledge that she's not feeling well. And in doing so, like, death is coming closer and closer and closer. And finally, at the end of the story, we see Miriam say hello. And that is death saying, hi, like, I'm here finally to take you. Let's go. Presumably, Mrs. Miller dies at the end of the story. But I think another point to the hallucination thing is it says, like, the last line is, hello, said Miriam, which I think is fascinating because Mrs. Miller acknowledges that her first name is Miriam. So which Miriam is saying hello at the end of this story? Like, it could be death, but again, it could also be that hallucination. I like how Truman Capote leaves it ambiguous there, and also leaves the story kind of a little bit vague, but also very purposeful in an effort to leave it very open to interpretation. There's a lot more that could be discussed that I haven't really, acknowledged yet here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Miriam by Truman Capote. Pretty solid short story, one of the better short stories that I've read for this channel. I really like the ambiguous nature, the very strange child just showing up, and a very good look into Mrs. Miller's psyche. I find that I'm really enjoying psychological storytelling more and more, especially if you recall my video that I made on Passing by Nella Larson. I do think that there's a lot of good things that could be explored with that kind of storytelling. And I definitely recommend that you go read this out there. I'll put a link to it in the description so that you could read it. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Let's have a discussion about Truman Capote. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or possibly join the Discord so that other people can find out about this author or this short story if they don't already know, and so that we can continue to have this conversation on the Discord as well. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and intrusive child travels. Farewell.